Good evening and welcome to ACT TV's Season 2, Episode 4. And we've got a very special guest on tonight, Cameron Bagrie, in my mind, the straightest shooting, most insightful economist that New Zealand has. We're really grateful to have him on. He's going to be talking about the immediate economic problem faced by businesses. So many people in business under pressure on their cash flow. Even if there's going to be a rebound after this, they need to be there for it. Some of the macro effects on interest rates and house prices, but then the wider topic of how we bring economic thinking to the COVID challenge, because economics is fundamentally about how people balance off different desires and different needs that they have. When you can't have everything, you've got to make economic decisions. And there's health, there's mobility, and there's business all tussling and competing with each other in different countries around the world. We believe that that is the wider discussion we need so that we're focused on people's overall well-being, because COVID's very important, but it will never be everything. Today, we had a couple of interesting revelations in Parliament, perhaps one that didn't come out in Parliament, but maybe should have, because the government chose not to tell anybody until after question time had begun. This was the issue of the escapee from a quarantine site. Someone who'd already escaped before managed to escape again. Now, we know that no government and no system is perfect, and if you've got someone stupid enough to do that, they're eventually going to. In fact, according to the news, the guy was dobbed in by his own family. But what's really important is the government chose not to tell us until hours after it had happened. You had a guy with Delta running through the community. The police were looking for him. Wouldn't that have been a good time for the government to say, folks, we've got a bit of a problem here. You can probably help us solve it. Instead, they kept it under wraps. The Prime Minister was talking to the entire New Zealand media. It's reported she knew about it, but she decided not to have a discussion. Chris Hipkins was asked about this. He said, well, we don't really want to get into that conversation. Since when did the government, from the podium of truth, get to decide what sort of conversations New Zealanders had? Wouldn't it be better if instead they chose to bring us into their confidence, treat us like adults, and give all New Zealanders ownership of this problem, not just in little ways like there's a prisoner or at least a quarantinee escaped that might be a public health danger right now and you could help, but actually with the wider issues of the data about COVID, how many vaccine doses they really have because their numbers don't add up. And a second one is, what is the strategy for the South Island? I asked the Prime Minister today, how many people in the South Island who are traced contacts are still awaiting their final negative test? And it turned out the answer was 22. This is catch-22 for the South Island. It turns out the government's policy is to lock down 1 million people because there's 22 people who've had one negative test already, awaiting their second negative test, and they are so paranoid about the quality of their own response that they're not prepared to give freedom to 1 million people to go about attending to many other aspects of their welfare on account of 22 people who've already tested negative. The Prime Minister also said, well, it's just that we don't actually know if we've traced all the contacts. Really? After 16 days, the so-called gold standard of contact tracing was 80% of all contacts within 96 hours. After 16 days, that's 4 times longer than 96 hours. They still haven't got all the contacts with certainty. So the whole South Island remains in lockdown. Now, it's not just that I'm pitching for the South Island vote, although that would be very nice. It actually has serious implications for all of us. The problem is, if the government's response in terms of tracing, isolating, and testing cases is so poor that they actually can't rely on anything beyond waiting for lockdown long enough that the virus would have burnt out anyway, then our whole elimination strategy is in really big trouble. And that's why we're bringing on Cameron Bagrie, an economist, tonight to talk a little bit more about the economics of COVID and the problems we face, the challenges and decisions that we have, and how the government's response can weigh those up to give business one thing that everybody needs right now, and that is some certainty. We're also going to be joined by another special guest, one of ACT's 10 MPs, our representative on the Finance and Expenditure Committee, our associate finance spokesperson, a former head of ASB South Island, MBA, a man who hails all the way originally from Northern Ireland, having made his way down through Europe, through Australia, and now having worked as a director, business owner and consultant in New Zealand, one of ACT's MPs putting the economic case for low taxes, personal freedom, and economic growth of productivity, better investments, and more exports. And that's Damien Smith. Damien, welcome. It's really great to have you on the show. How are you going?
Good, David. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, great to hear your voice, as always. And Cameron Bagrie, as I mentioned, straightest shooting economist, very insightful in New Zealand, and a former ANZ chief economist, now heading up Bagrie Economics. And he has a new service at 7 p.m. on Sundays. You can get it straight from the hip, insightful economic analysis from Cameron. And if you'd like to do that, he's complained about the number of subscriptions and people emailing him he's already got after he announced it on his LinkedIn profile. But Cameron, I'm going to give you a few more. If you're interested in hearing more from Cameron Bagrie, then please email him. I think I've got it right. It's cameron@bagrieeconomics.com. Or is it .co.nz?
.co.nz. And it's
.co.nz.
It's 8 o'clock
very
on Sunday. It's short, it's sweet, and it's pretty direct.
Well, that's what we like. So just to start off with some of the economics that's going on, I mean, talk us through business. You're saying 6 to 7% decline in GDP as a result of this lockdown. You're talking about a resurgence, but you also mentioned there's a few other issues that come up to do with the onset of holidays that might potentially interrupt any bounce back after this lockdown. And also, how do businesses make sure their cash flow is maintained so they can actually be there for that resurgence?
Yeah, well, there's a whole lot of things going on. Look, are we going to see a bounce that's going to be pretty substantial once we get into full relief or out of lockdown? What we saw in 2020 is likely to repeat to a lesser degree, because there's not the same degree of policy stimulus that's been thrown at it this time around. And certainly in regard to the likes of the wage subsidy, it's been drip fed as opposed to pushed out there in a big bang fashion. But yeah, when you lock people down for 2, 3, or in the case of Auckland, what's looking like 4, 5, 6 weeks is my suspicion. As soon as you get out of that lockdown mode, you're going to be out there, you're going to be off to the races, getting a haircut, buying all those items that you deferred. So the December quarter, subject to getting a lockdown, is going to look okay. There's a couple of issues. Issue one is, what is COVID or Delta going to mean in the next 5 years for what's called the economic base, the productive capacity for New Zealand? Economics 101 is that money needs to come in the door before it can go out the door on the other side. So yes, housing, the social agenda is important, but ultimately something's got to pay for it on the other side. And one of the big questions we've got at the moment is that, what is the productive capacity, economic base of not just New Zealand, but every economy around the globe look like in a world where Delta is obviously not going to be eliminated? We've got to learn to deal with this thing. Now, we can deal with it a number of ways. Elimination up to a point where you get a high vaccination rate, and then you've got to open up. But you're still going to see the productive capacity base of the New Zealand economy is going to get knocked around over the next sort of 5 years. And what we're trying to work out at the moment is, what is that economic impact going to be over a sustained period? In the near term, my big attention is actually on cash flow, where the firms have got it, and at the moment they don't. The good news is that firms have been hoarding cash. We're seeing that within savings transaction balances within the banks that have soared over the past 12 months because people have been pretty conservative in regard to their investment plans. But the longer this lockdown goes on, particularly in Auckland, the more those cash reserves are going to be depleted. And what worries me is the gap between now and Christmas, particularly for Auckland firms. The longer you're in lockdown, the narrower that window becomes to actually make some money pre-Christmas. Because we all know that around Christmas, we go on holiday, people don't do stuff, you go spend money elsewhere. You don't tend to do too much in January. So you're not really invoicing back into it until sort of February, March next year. So there could be a long time between drinks in regard to how the cash flow coming in the door looks like. And what we also know is that what tends to crucify a lot of businesses is not the money coming in the door immediately. It's when you open the door and the money you've got to spend to get back up and operational. And lockdown is going to face real pressure once it unlocks. Your firms are going to see money going out the door before money's coming in the door on the other side. So there's going to be, I think, some pretty severe cash flow pressure over the next 4 to 8 weeks.
So is that something that requires a policy response, in your view, different from what's happening now?
Yeah, look, what they're doing in regard to the wage subsidy is the right thing. That they're characterising as business support. It's not business support. It's employee support. There is the business resurgence payment, which helps around the margin as well. But I don't think there's a full appreciation in regard to what lockdown means for the cash flow position of businesses. If you look at the central scenario for Auckland at the moment, the central scenario for Auckland at the moment, in all honesty, I think it's going to be more than 4 weeks at level 4. Well, that's longer than what Auckland spent at level 4 last time around.
So sorry, David.
You go, David.
Yeah, so we've got a government that's spending up large, and it's getting bigger and bigger. And the hardworking Kiwis and taxpayers out there, my feeling is that ACT's fighting in our corner. But one of our strategies is to reduce taxes for the middle class and lower class workers. Do you see that as being a stimulatory effect?
Well, I guess, if you look at the broad policy response, one thing is pretty clear, is that the use of fiscal policy is the right mechanism to be using in the near term. Now we can get into debates about, well, are we better off to spend in regard to infrastructure, put more money in people's pockets directly in regard to increasing benefits or cutting taxes. Now, each can have their pros and cons, but I think we can agree on one thing, is that fiscal policy has got a pretty strong stabilisation role in regard to what you need to be doing. And it's not just about the near-term effect. You've got to think about shaping expectations and driving the right economic incentives down the track. Because what we've got at the moment, pre-COVID, if you look at where we are in New Zealand, we don't have a problem with demand. In fact, pre-COVID, we had a problem with excess demand. The economy was too hot to trot. Now, demand was outstripping supply. Now, there's two options going forward. Option one is that we hit demand, we slow it down. And the Reserve Bank was set to do that by lifting interest rates. Option two is about getting the supply side capacity of New Zealand up. Now, that's pretty tough in a COVID environment where we're seeing borders restricted, access to workers is restricted as well. But we need to be having a big debate over the next few years in New Zealand about how we can improve the functionality of the supply side of New Zealand and getting those right economic incentives in place in regard to driving the right behaviours, such as the incentives to get out there and work a little bit more. That's where tax cuts can actually have a real big economic punch, not just in regard to getting money into people's pockets, but fundamentally shifting those economic incentives.
So you're talking supply side. Oh, sorry, Damien, you go.
Yeah, well, I mean, labour productivity and productivity growth, we're just going backward in every single benchmark that as a nation, whether it's socially, economically, or supply side. And we sort of need to start getting real now about the next 5-10 years as an open economy and a modern economy. But finding government comparing us to the UK and USA, that's not the right comparison, I feel.
Well, let me put it another way. I mean, what you're saying is we need something on the supply side. Tax reduction is one way of changing incentives, make it more attractive to work, save, and invest. And being ACT, we've always been pretty keen on that. What about on the regulatory side, or are there other things other than tax and regulation that a government could do over the coming years, the 5 or 10 years that Damien's mentioning, that would actually improve supply so that we have a better economic recovery?
Yeah, I think we've got to really get real about our trading position. We've got to really have a lot of partnerships with OECD countries that are like-minded and actually want to do business with us and bring more capital into the country. So ACT's policy is to produce jobs that actually have higher wages.
Yeah, I couldn't disagree more. I couldn't agree more. Sorry. Look, you're absolutely right. But can I just come back to Cam on what you were saying about the Reserve Bank, and in particular, You've said in recent times that the halt, or at least the delay in the expected OCR increase, you're saying you don't believe that will push another rise in house prices. Conventional wisdom is, cheap money is just going to keep pushing house prices up. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, I guess if you look at what's driven house prices, not just in the last 12 to 24 months, you got to go back 30 years. And asset prices in general, whether it be equities, residential property, commercial property, have had the biggest tailwind at their back in history. And the Reserve Bank put some work out in 2019 that basically said about 50% of the increase in house prices can be put down to lower and lower interest rates over a sustained period. Now, if interest rates are no longer going down, because they're basically at zero at the moment, then you take out that 50% boost to asset prices. But then you start to think about what it looks like on the other side. Does it work in a symmetrical fashion, such as when interest rates move up? Does that mean you start subtracting a pretty big number in regard to where house prices are going to be going forward? And what we know is a couple of things. Look, one, wealth accumulation in New Zealand for a long sustained period has been driven by house prices. It hasn't been driven by the real productive economy. Now, if I have a look at what's going on across New Zealand at the moment, the housing market is under the gun of the regulator because the Reserve Bank is now viewing it as a financial stability risk. So they're tightening the noose. The government has to be very proactive across housing because if they are not, they're going to face intense political scrutiny in regard to sorting it out. Some of the policies they're bringing in make sense. Some of the stuff is Looney Tunes. And then you've got the interest rate effect. So here's the end conclusion here. What if the property market is not the golden goose that lays golden eggs for the next 30 years? What is wealth accumulation going to look like in New Zealand? And to me, we're going to need to be investing in the real productive part of New Zealand. Now, that seems like a really hard ask at the moment because the real productive part of New Zealand is getting absolutely slogged by higher business costs. So imagine that transition away from that housing investment into the more risky stuff at a time you're facing COVID, you're facing increasing burden, regulatory costs, that sort of stuff. But I think it's real early days, and these sort of theme shifts, they take a long time to come to fruition. I think it's going to be 5 to 10 years before the penny drops. It's real early stages. But Adrian Orr, when he's been coming out and saying house prices are unsustainable at current levels, I'm in his court.
I think what you say, you're speaking our language. Fundamentally, we've got to ask, why is it so difficult to get investment in the productive sector? Why do our exports as a percentage of GDP seem to have declined so much in the last 20 years? And why is productivity growth, as Damien mentioned, so low, labour productivity in particular? I guess what you're saying is that this COVID might be exactly the reset required to shift the policy focus towards those other goals. But one of the biggest things that government needs to do is actually just stop stopping people. We've had a whole lot of questions coming through. One that potentially gets to that is somebody's just said, what do you see as being the effect of the climate change legislation, the Climate Change Commission and the Zero Carbon Act rules? And also, I might just add on to that, what the government calls fair pay agreements. Acts would call them compulsory unionism, but you might have a more nuanced view on those two and their effect on the supply side.
Right, so let's have a look at this through a bigger picture economic lens. And Economics 101 is that you need money coming in the door before it goes out the door, so well-being needs an economic base. Let's have a look at what that economic base is looking like 10 years out. Observation one is that COVID and Delta is likely to hit the productive capacity of New Zealand over a sustained period. Can we put a precise number on that? The answer is no. Observation two is that government policy is very clearly shifted to be more redistributional. And there's some fair reasons for that in regard to Labor's share of what's called GDP has gotten, I think, unsustainably low. We need to be paying attention to putting more money into people's pockets. The problem is you need the productivity growth to match on the other side. And at the moment, it seems to be all about redistributing the pie as opposed to growing the pie on the other side. Observation three is climate change. Do we need to face up to our climate change responsibilities? The answer is hell yes. But we need to be realistic here in regard to New Zealand, our economic advantage. We're a $30 billion net food exporter. We sell food and we import manufactured stuff and all the toys, the plastic stuff from China. Now, if we do not find a methane busting technology in New Zealand, that productive base is going to be under real stress. And at the moment, there's no logical replacements in regard to where we're going to be substituting some of the growth we used to see out of dairying and red meat. Horticulture's got, I think, huge potential, subject to one constraint in regard to labour accessibility. And then observation 4 is, effectively shock 4. What if the housing market's no longer the golden goose? Now to me, that combination is going to hit us intensely in the next 5 to 10 years. And this is where we're caught in that short-term COVID narrative where we're responding on a day-by-day basis, which we need to, but we're not sitting back and thinking about the bigger picture in regard to where we're going to be 10 years down the track. Observation 5, if I'm looking about where New Zealand is going to be not just 10 years down the track, 30 years down the track, big economic lead indicator is education. What are we seeing across the education sector at the moment? We're seeing rising truancy and falling achievement rates. It's not a great signal in regard to where New Zealand is going to be 30 years out.
Again, we couldn't agree with you more. It was interesting, we heard the Prime Minister say today, local communities know their people better than some government departments in Wellington, and we need lots of innovation. And I thought she was going to say she'd made a mistake getting rid of charter schools, but it turns out she's basically in favour of charter vaccination centres. She'll let local communities do that, which we support, but they're not prepared to do it for education. And if we don't get some of those test scores up and the amount of knowledge that the next generation has as they enter the workforce, then I think we're in some real trouble. And it's not a bad segue to a question from...
Can I just add something there, David? We've actually, the government is collecting more and more information on truancy rates, and they aggregate it up across the regions. But we got that information basically down into quite fine level detail. So we must be able to break that stuff down and work out what models work. What skill characteristics result in more attendance as opposed to less. It's a question of ripping into the data and using data to make informed policy decisions.
Well, that sounds far too sensible. Look, I think the dirty secret of New Zealand education policy, if being an Undersecretary for Education taught me anything, is that it's all driven not by the teachers, but by the union representatives, and they insist on one size fits all at every state, and it is costing us just so much. It's not a bad segue, though, into a comment by Matt here. Matt says, I'm 25 and worried about paying back all the debt we're borrowing. I understand people can't be left to starve. Well, compassionate of you, Matt. But what will my future look like in 20 years if I have to pay it back in tax? And I think there's a wider question there. People say that money's somehow become free because we've got these ultra low interest rates around the world. Is that sustainable, and should Matt be worried about
it? It's a really good question from Matt on a whole lot of levels. Good news story is that the government's books are in really good shape right here and now relative to international peers. If you look at the trend though in regard to what we're going to see for debt, we're on a rising trajectory. There's nothing wrong with accumulating debt if you invest in that smartly in New Zealand's economic future down the track. And we can get into the debate in regard to whether that investment is right or not. The government is championing, saying government debt's going to peak around 45% of GDP, and then it's going to get back down to 30%. It only gets back down to 30 by crunching infrastructure spending. There's no allowance within that for the Three Waters project, which is about 125 to 175 billion. The other thing, which no one's talking about enough, is the fiscal impact of an ageing population. And that is an absolute noose around New Zealand's neck. So if you ever look at the projections within Treasury's long-term fiscal model, it's got government debt going to about 190% of GDP. Now, that's not going to take place. It basically tells us we need to make some real hard choices going forward. And these are the basic choices. Look, choice 1 is you increase taxes. Choice 2 is you can cut back on the entitlements, i.e. raise the super age, these sort of things. Option 3 is that you look at fundamentally redesigning the healthcare system, because where we're going to see a lot of pressure is within healthcare, because it is very much population driven. Option 4 is that you crunch other parts of government spending. So you don't spend too much on core government services or education. But those are the choices. There is another one. And it's the one we should be aspiring to. If you get more money coming in the door, you get more of a well-being base you can sustain on the other side.
So fundamentally, having a government whose policies are almost entirely focused on how to divide up wealth that already exists is going to take us down one of those first four tracks, which aren't very attractive they're all unattractive to someone, most of them unattractive to 25-year-old Matt here. On the other hand, if you have a relentless focus on how do you raise productivity, how do you move New Zealand firms up the value chain, then potentially this could be a happy ending, but it's not looking like that right now. Matt, I just want to say I think you hit the nail on the head. Brooke Van Velden, our deputy leader, had a great column in my view, in the Herald yesterday, and it made many of these same points, that the impacts of COVID and the government's response to it are different depending on how long you're going to be a taxpayer. And the longer you're going to be a taxpayer, the more costly it is to be on our current path of maintaining elimination with lockdowns as the only tool. I just got one, this might end up being our last question, but sort of comes back to the nub of the current COVID situation and how they relate to a lot of the things you've been saying tonight, Cameron. Bob says, we heard tonight building supplies for our project could be stuck in Auckland. How will these delays affect the recovery and how long could they last? Well, Cameron, if you could get your crystal ball out, Bob would love you to answer that.
Well, my personal view is that, when they said Auckland was going to be in lockdown for another 2 weeks, I was basically bid on. At that stage, I was thinking 3 to 4. And I still think that's the more likely scenario than getting out of in regard to 2. Then you start to think about how long you'll be at level 3, level 2, and all of a sudden you're moving into October. And shutting down Auckland doesn't have the direct effect of hitting the Auckland economy. It has the indirect effect through the supply chain of hitting the economy across the board. And the supply chain in New Zealand is getting absolutely slaughtered, not just in regard to COVID, domestically with the Delta variant, but it's the supply chain internationally, getting stuff in and out, the cost of getting stuff in and out. And questions are now starting to focus on, well, what does it actually look like on the other side? And we haven't really talked about that discussion that as a country we need to start to have, and it's that discussion we alluded to right at the start between your health, economic, and mobility trade-offs. We cannot keep the economy indefinitely shut. That is going to have terrible social outcomes on the other side. I'd love to see the data last year on suicide rates. Look, anecdotally, there seem to be a lot of stories. I personally lost people. That's what happens when the economy becomes a collateral damage and a very strongly health-based focus. Now, do we need to have that strong focus on health-based outcomes? The answer is yes. But we need to start to shift that conversation, have those narratives. You have that bigger picture thinking in regard to what does the other side look like? Businesses need to have that in their corner. Well, where are we going to from here? At the moment, they're sort of hanging on, sort of wondering, Christ, should I hang on? What does the plan look like on the other side? Leadership is about giving people a bit of plan, not just a bit of hope, a bit of a plan, an idea. This is what things are going to look like.
Yeah, and I think that the fundamental ingredient to getting investment is certainty. We're going to have to wrap this up. I just want to thank you again, Cameron Bagrie from Bagrie Economics. That was more open-minded, insightful, blue sky thinking about the situation New Zealand's in and what the factors it needs to consider over the next, not just few months, but few years really are. So we thank you for appearing on ACT TV. Stick around for a moment. Thank you very much, Damien Smith, ACT MP, based in Auckland, banker, MBA, director, and definitely the most suave dresser in the ACT caucus, I should add. Thank you very much. I just want to say quickly for anyone who may have been disturbed by the comments that we just heard, I certainly have heard of people suffering terribly with their mental health through these lockdowns with the various impacts it has. If you are in any way concerned or feeling sad or in any way likely to harm yourself or others, then it's very important that the first thing you do is talk to someone. Reach out to a friend, a family member, a colleague, a co-worker, whomever. Or if those aren't options, try calling one of the good services that are out there, 1737, Lifeline, Youthline. You can find a lot more online, but there are people who will talk to you and you should talk to them. That's the end of ACT TV tonight. Tomorrow night, we're actually going to be talking specifically about mental health with our Deputy Leader and Health Spokesperson, Brooke Van Velden, about the policy that she developed last year that's had rave reviews. Even terrible lefties like Matthew Tutaki have said, I hate to say it, but ACT's got the best policy on mental health. She's going to be talking about what she's hearing from people through this lockdown and how ACT's policy would transform the very frustrating and sclerotic mental health system that we have here in New Zealand today. Thank you very much for watching ACT TV. We'll be back for another night, and I can't wait to have further discussions about the future of our little country in this rather large and scary world right now. Good night.